Good afternoon. My name is Araceli Tinajero, and I'm professor of Hispanic literatures here at the Graduate Center and at the City College of New York. Welcome to the Bildner Center. We haven't had an in-person conference for more than 2 years, so we are very excited to come here. For many years at the Bildner Center, through the Cuba project, the Brazil project, and the Mexican Studies Group, we have organized conferences on ethnicity, urbanization, public security, literature, material culture, democracy, Hispanic studies, in Asia, elite and popular consumption practices, civil society, technology, and so on and so on. Just for your information, we used to have massive conferences. So now, since we are coming back little by little, so we have a petite conference, and we are very happy and very grateful that you made it today, even though it's raining out there. So thank you so much. It is my pleasure and my privilege today to introduce Professor Koichi Hagimoto, whom I know for many years. He's one of the scholars that work on Trans-Pacific studies. That is pretty much the relationship between Latin America and Asia. Just for the sake of the, to save some time, you were given a little pamphlet when you came in. So his biobibliography is there, but basically he's the author of Between Empires, Martí, Rizal, and the Intercolonial Alliance, and also his forthcoming book is Samurai in the Land of the Gaucho, Trans-Pacific Modernity and Nikkei Literature in Argentina. So today he will be talking about two very interesting books about produced by Nikkei, that means by Argentinians, Japanese of second generation Japanese in Argentina, correct? So he's going to explain a little bit more about it. I asked him to talk give us his talk in English, but since I believe everybody speaks Spanish as well, maybe he will be talking a little bit in Spanish. And then at the end, you may ask questions in Spanish or English or Japanese, if you wish, okay? So please help me welcome Professor Hagimoto.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and the generous introduction. My name is Koichi Hagimoto, and I'm really grateful for this amazing opportunity. If I learned anything from the last 2.5 years, is that I cannot take anything for granted. So I am deeply grateful for your time, for your presence, and really for everybody who made this event happen today. And special thanks go to, of course, Araceli and Rosalina and Bildner Center and the Graduate Center for this great event. And I hope you learned something interesting. I'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we're gonna have some conversation Q&A, and then I'll be having a conversation with Araceli as well. She is an amazing teacher. She has been an amazing mentor to me and a great friend. So you're very lucky to have her here, definitely. Okay, so what is Nikkei literature? It is a collection of literary work written by Japanese immigrants and their descendants. It encompasses the diverse experiences that are represented by the Japanese diaspora across the world. In this presentation, I will briefly examine the evolution of Nikkei literature in Argentina by focusing on two writers from different time periods. Yoshio Shinya, who was the first documented Japanese immigrant in Argentina, wrote his signature text, Imperio del Sol naciente, su maravillosa evolución moderna, Empire of the Rising Sun, its marvelous modern evolution in 1934, as a means to promote positive images of Japan. I argue that his celebration of Japanese imperialism was meant to suggest that his country could serve as an alternative model of modernity for Argentina. In the 21st century, a new group of Nikkei authors is rewriting this traditional notion of Japan through their immigrant literature. For example, Maximiliano Matayoshi published his first novel, Gaijin, in 2003. What is striking about Matayoshi's book is its depiction of his own experience as a racialized Japanese-Argentine, showing not only the instances of assimilation and discrimination, but also the manifestation of a hybrid multicultural identity. By analyzing Shinya's book and Matayoshi's novel, this seeks to portray different representations of Japaneseness in Argentina's Nikkei literature, both in the past and in the present. And I want to mention that this is a part of my book, my forthcoming book, A Samurai in the Land of the Gaucho, Trans-Pacific Modernity and Nikkei Literature in Argentina, which will be published next summer by Vanderbilt University Press. So I'm happy to receive any feedback or questions so I can explore these topics further. First, it is useful to provide a brief historical account of Japanese immigration to Argentina, where the migrant community has been relatively small. You don't think of the Japanese when you think of Argentina, right? According to the Association of Nikkei and Japanese Abroad, there are currently 65,000 people of Japanese descent in Argentina. That's the third largest Nikkei community in Latin America, after Brazil, that has 1.9 million people of Japanese descent, and Peru, 100,000 people. The small number of Nikkei Argentines can be explained in several ways. To begin with, their initial process of immigration was based not on a government-subsidized contract, but on their own spontaneous decisions and free will. And this is a picture of the statue commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Japanese immigration. Well, first, the majority of the first immigrants came from Okinawa, which is in the southern part of Japan. Used to be a different country and had their own culture. They're separate from the mainland Japan. Upon arrival, these Japanese had neither the information about rural conditions nor a large sum of capital investment to start a business. Despite these obstacles, they found employment in transportation, hotels, and restaurants. Some wealthy residents of Buenos Aires hired Japanese immigrants as domestic servants, especially as drivers and gardeners. As these immigrants moved towards self-employment in the early 20th century, tintoreria, or dry cleaners, became a thriving business. Because of the efficient service at tintoreria, the Japanese gradually gained respect and trust in society, establishing upper working class families. Partly due to this small size, the Japanese in Argentina have historically lived under a more agreeable socio-political climate than other countries, although this does not mean that they were completely spared from racism and discrimination, of course. What I mean is that they did not experience systemic anti-Japanese campaigns, the kind of epistemic violence that took place in Brazil and Peru. And just to mention some examples, Brazil created a statewide discrimination campaign against people of Japanese descent through the politics of Estado Novo during the 1920s and 30s, while the climate of anti-Japanese racism culminated in Peru when over 1,700 Japanese nationals and Nikkei Peruvians were illegally kidnapped and sent to US internment camps during World War II. In contrast, to use the anthropologist Marcelo Higa's words, the Japanese in Argentina were treated with positive prejudice, prejuicio positivo, in their history of immigration. As Higa puts it, and I quote, they, Argentines, created an image that associated the Japanese with characteristics of positive connotations, silence, respect, hygiene, honesty, work, and self-sacrifice, etc. A semantic universe not exempt from discriminatory connotations, but that immigrant appropriated and knew how to take advantage of years later. End of quote. The positive reception of Japanese immigrants also reflects the interest of Argentina's politicians and intellectuals to establish a close relationship with Japan. In the 1920s, President Marcelo Torcuato de Alvear implemented a policy that encouraged Japanese immigration as a way to advance agriculture and the fishing industries. During World War II, Argentina kept a neutral stance and only declared war at the last minute on March 27, 1945, when pressured by the US. As a result, while some restrictions were applied, such as a ban on meetings, it is understood that most Japanese residents did not suffer serious consequences. While Japanese Brazilians were systematically labeled as enemy aliens, Japanese Argentines were merely regarded as foreigners under vigilance. It is in this context of positive prejudice that I now turn to Yoshio Shinya, who was the first Japanese immigrant to have set foot in Argentina through official means. Originally from Saga Prefecture in the western part of Japan, Shinya joined the Navy ship Sarmiento as an assistant in 1899. The 16-year-old Shinya followed the ship around the world before arriving to Buenos Aires in 1900. Of particular note is his close relationship with the veteran Argentine admiral, Manuel Domecq Garcia, who witnessed the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 and became an admirer of the Japanese Navy. And this was when Japan defeated the Russian Empire and became the first Asian country to overcome a European power. So it was a big deal. According to Domecq Garcia, and I quote, Yoshio Shinya is an Argentine in spirit. He loves our country with true affection. And of course, I am translating all the text from Spanish into English for this project. As a fervent nationalist, Shinya published several books about his native country for the Argentine readership, once again in Spanish. In addition, he contributed to such national newspapers as La Prensa, El Mundo, La Nación, and El Diario, as well as serving as a correspondent for some Japanese newspapers, including Kokumin Shimbun, Tokyo Nichinichi Shimbun, and Tokyo Asahi Shimbun. Moreover, Shinya's dual identity, which is something I'm interested in. He is a promoter of Imperial Japan on the one hand, and a pioneer of Japanese immigration in Argentina on the other. This dual identity can be understood in line with Eiichiro Azuma's notion of borderless settler colonialism, which, and I quote, not only functioned to shore up the backbone of Japan's empire building, but also promoted the borderless quest of Japanese overseas development in accordance with the Western precedent of frontier conquest and civilization building. So what I'm interested in is how the discourse of Japanese imperialism was translated into the narrative of immigration and assimilation in the new country in Argentina. Published in 1934, Imperio del Sol Naciente is Shinya's signature text because of its extensive coverage of the history of the Japanese Empire. The book explores both the ancient and the modern history of Japan, with topics ranging from politics, religion, and economy to education, art, and culture. The glorification of the empire is unequivocal throughout the book. For example, Shinya refers to Japan as, and I quote, a country of the Far East, until then all but unknown, the empire of the rising sun, which began its ascending march on the path of glory. Japan's expansionist view is often reflected in his nationalist discourse, which argues that the country has the right to claim its legitimate role as one of the most powerful nations in the world. And I quote, Japan emerged from centuries of isolation from the rest of the world, confident in itself, firmly resolved, full of noble ambitions, radiant and impetuous, like the bright morning star, and ready to conquer a dominant place on earth. End of quote. In some way, this language invokes a colonialist attitude that shows a firm determination to quote unquote conquer the world. As Japan pursued imperial objectives on the Asian continent beginning in 1894, the country's ambition to claim a dominant place was felt everywhere by the 1930s. And just to give you some examples, Japan's expansionism was seen in the occupation of Hokkaido, the northern part of Japan, in 1869, and the Ryukyu Island of Okinawa in 1897, the colonization of Taiwan of 1895, the annexation of Korea in 1910, and of course the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Not unlike the idea of America's manifest destiny, then, Shinya's book suggests that modern Japan is destined to follow its ascending path, quote unquote, in the socio-political and economic spheres. Furthermore, Shinya also turns to Japan's history of socio-political transformations following the 1868 Meiji Restoration, whereby the country incorporated Western models. For him, Japan's exceptionalism is based on its place as, and I quote, the natural leader of the Oriental races in adopting Occidental ways and thoughts, end of quote. With Japan's strong desire for modernization and westernization in mind, he advocates his country as a new model for civilization. And I quote, the Japanese influence had the gift of putting a halt to the dominating politics of the Western powers in the Far East, showcasing at the same time with the facts the possibility of harmonic fusion between the two great civilizations of the East and the West, once considered absolutely irreconcilable. Those of us who have studied Orientalism in American literature know that this allusion to the fusion between the East and the West is nothing new. As Araceli Tinajero and others have shown, many Latin American writers have addressed this literary mixture since 19th century modernismo. What is unique about Shinya is his specific locus of enunciation as an Asian immigrant in South America. Considering that his intended audience was Argentine public, his depiction of Japan as a country of fusion can be understood as a deliberate move toward promoting the positive image of his native land. He suggests that Japan presents a desirable form of civilization to Argentina, not only owning to its rich history of cultural synthesis, but also, perhaps more importantly, because of its widespread Western influence. In this regard, he makes a clear distinction between Japan and its neighboring countries. And I quote, while Japan found itself eagerly caught up in organizing its institutions according to the Western model by embracing important innovations of modern civilization, its two neighbors, Korea and China, remained stubbornly attached to the old routine. They disregarded foreign customs and hated to enter into relations of exchange with interested powers. End of quote. Here, Shinya seems to propose that the Japanese can bring a new kind of modernity to Argentina based on their successful integration of Western characteristics, unlike Chinese and Koreans who are incapable of adapting foreign traditions. Nevertheless, it must be recognized that his allusion to Japan's harmonious fusion does not mean that this East-West binary is placed in equal terms. To him, Western modernization is clearly preferable to Eastern backwardness. In the lecture he delivered at the Japanese-Argentine Cultural Institute in 1941, Shinya emphasized the prevalent influence of the West in his country, as he puts it, and I quote, Western civilization in what is useful and beneficial for life and the scientific, mechanical application of human knowledge today reaches all corners of the empire. In short, he considers Japan the most quote-unquote Western nation in East Asia. By addressing Japan as a modern country with prominent Western features, Shinya expresses his support for Japanese immigration in Argentina. The Japanese, he claims, are not only civilized, but also loyal to the authority, which would make them ideal candidates to improve the host society. Like his associate Domecq Garcia, who was among the most sympathetic supporters of the relations between Japan and Argentina, Shinya displayed loyalty to both his country of origin and his adopted country. His commitment to making a better Argentina is evident in the article published in 1934 titled Call on the Youth. As he declares, I aspire to collaborate with the Argentine youth to make this land a great nation, because I am convinced that here on the banks of the Plata, a model people must be formed for the civilized world, since no other country has the elements and conditions that the Providence granted to us. End of quote. As both a fervent nationalist and the first Japanese immigrant, Shinya skillfully synthesized and translated the discourse of imperialism and the narrative of assimilation. He did not hesitate to celebrate the glory of the Japanese Empire, and some members of Argentina's elite class were drawn to these positive images based on their own sense of exceptionalism. Consequently, his writings made no small contributions to the history of positive prejudice, and as well as the myth of a model minority for early Japanese immigration. And now, more than a half century later, the representation of Japan and the Japanese immigrants takes a different turn. One might wonder why it took so long to challenge this traditional notion of Japan and the Japanese in Argentina. Unlike Brazil and Peru, Argentina does not have a long history of Nikkei literary and cultural production, largely due to the small size of the immigrant population. What I am interested in is to underline the creation of a hybrid transnational immigrant identity in the work of Maximiliano Matayoshi. While Shinya described Japan through a romanticized, uncritical view of its native land, today's Nikkei writers are creating narratives or counter-narratives that are more nuanced and multifaceted. Besides Matayoshi, contemporary Nikkei writers in Argentina include Alejandra Camilla, Virginia Higa, Maria Claudia Otsubo, and Martin Sancia Kawamichi, just to name a few. So it is a growing group of authors. Matayoshi is a second-generation Japanese-Argentine, or Nisei, who won the prestigious Premio Primera Novela UNAM Alfaguara in 2002 for his novel Gaijin, meaning outsider or foreigner. The story begins with the journey of a 13-year-old protagonist, Kitaro, who leaves his family in post-war Okinawa to find a better life in Argentina. Upon arrival, his best friend from the trip, Kei Arakaki, and his uncle end up adopting him in their family because Kitaro has no family ties in the new country. Together with Kei, Kitaro starts working at the Arakaki family's tintoreria while learning Spanish and gradually assimilating to the new country. After completing a degree in medicine in Mendoza, Kitaro decides to visit his family in Japan. At the end of the story, we find him anxious to return to Argentina to be reunited with his girlfriend, Julieta, one of the daughters of the Arakaki family. In the novel, Kitaro strives to preserve emotional ties to his homeland. After living in Argentina for several years, he still refers to Japanese as my language and Japan as my country. One of the cultural values that Kitaro embraces is the practice of silence, which is described as an essential mode of communication among Japanese and Japanese-Argentine characters in the novel. For these characters, silence does not simply imply the absence of words or feelings. On the contrary, it represents a productive space through which to express different emotions, including joy, anger, frustration, and love. In particular, silence plays a key role in the relationship between Kitaro and his girlfriend Julieta. As the protagonist explains, with Julieta, silence did not bother me. When he returns from Mendoza to Buenos Aires, he still feels comfortable communicating with her in silence. And I quote, it was still very easy to talk to her because silence was not uncomfortable and we did not need so many words to understand each other. End of quote. In a way, their romantic relationship is nurtured quietly rather than through dialogue. Another example of Kitaro's Japaneseness is manifested when he breaks up with Nenina, who is Argentine born and the daughter of his Spanish teacher, Mrs. Hoffman. When they first meet at church, Kitaro immediately falls in love with Nenina and begins to attend Mass regularly. His friend Kay tells him that she would never be interested in him because she is an Argentine. Nevertheless, the two become good friends and even entertain the idea of semi-romance until one day Mrs. Hoffman and Nenina leave the town without bidding farewell to Kitaro. Heartbroken, he regrets having left Japan. I quote, "What was I doing in that house? I have traveled thousands of kilometers for months only to iron clothes for the rest of my life. I should have stayed in Japan." This episode can be interpreted as an instance of racial othering in which the Japanese protagonist is seen as an uninvited foreign other who is not to be mixed with Argentines of European descent. By underscoring the impossibility of mixed-race relationship, Matayoshi's novel makes a subtle critique of the essentializing narrative of race relations in Argentina. With regard to the notion of otherness, it must also be noted that Gaijin makes explicit references to the racial discrimination experienced by Japanese immigrants. First, the novel describes Julieta's frustration when people call her quote-unquote Chinese and make fun of her at church. Later, Kitaro experiences the same kind of racism when he moves to Mendoza. And I quote, "Some kids who were playing soccer let the ball escape, which stopped near me. Hey Chinese, pass me the ball. Pass me the ball. I kicked it, but somehow it did not go where I wanted. You dumb Chinese, go back to China. Qin Chunling." They yelled, and I stopped listening to other insults. According to Matayoshi, this scene was based on a real-life experience which initially led him to resist his Nikkei identity. As I explained earlier, the Japanese in Argentina did not endure state-sponsored racism. Nevertheless, neither Kitaro nor Matayoshi seem able to escape the reality of xenophobia. The experience is, of course, is nothing new. It is well known that Asians, almost always referred to as Chinos, regardless of one's specific origin, are relegated to the margins of history in Argentina and elsewhere. Through the derogatory language such as dumb Chinese and Qin Chunling, Matayoshi criticizes racial stigmatization against Japanese and other Asians. While the elements of Japaneseness have left their stamp on Kitaro, his Argentineness also becomes evident as the new country begins to assume prominent place in its transnational immigrant identity. By the time he returns to Japan, he has already been so integrated into Argentine society that he has difficulty remembering the faces of his mother and his sister. Instead, his family in Mendoza has replaced those in Japan as the people he feels closest to. It is at this point that Kitaro realizes that Argentina has become his new home. And I quote, 13 years ago, I had embarked on crossing all oceans in order to return home one day. And to achieve this, I learned to iron, learned a language, and also learned that there exist lands where you cannot even imagine the sea. I crossed those lands, and now I was ready to cross oceans again. End of quote. The stereotypical image of an Issei, or first generation immigrant, is someone who is reluctant to accept the host country, always yearning to go back to his homeland. However, Kitaro seems to represent the opposite. For him, Argentina is the place he ultimately belongs to. At the same time, it is also important to recognize that neither country is able to offer him the kind of security he's seeking. In other words, his home is not exclusively Japan nor Argentina. Japan is not a home in a geographical sense, and yet its cultural associations are strong enough to constantly remind him of his roots. Argentina, on the other hand, is physically closer but not safe enough to prevent the experience of discrimination. Caught between the two countries and not feeling at home in either of them, Kitaro finds intimacy through the people he comes to love. As the cultural theorist Svetlana Boyan reminds us, and I quote, to feel at home is to know that things are in their places and so are you. It is a state of mind that doesn't depend on an actual location. The object of longing then is not really a place called home, but the sense of intimacy in the world. End of quote. And I'm gonna finish my presentation with some concluding remarks. Read together, my analysis of Imperio del Sol naciente and Gaijin shows the evolution of Nikkei literature in Argentina. While Shinya presents positive images of Japan and Argentina, Matayoshi offers a more critical view. It goes without saying that the world has changed considerably since the publication of Shinya's book in the early 20th century. In a way, Matayoshi's novel reflects a cultural shift in contemporary Argentina, where there is a renewed attempt to redefine itself as a diverse and multicultural nation. Considering the particular historical conditions in which the two writers found themselves, we can conclude that there is no such a thing as a singular narrative of Japan or Japaneseness in Nikkei literature. And this is also one of the arguments for my new project, which is an anthology of Nikkei writers in North America, which I am co-editing with Ignacio Lopez Calvo. And the anthology represents a diverse, a wide range of Nikkei voices across North America. And some of the authors include Carlos Sushimito del Valle from Peru, Alejandra Camilla from Argentina, Laura Honda Segawa from Brazil, Carlos Nakatani from Mexico, and Pedro Simose from Bolivia. And it's a project that we're working on and hopefully have a final product next year to represent this diverse range of different generations, different countries, and different voices. One of the goals of my larger study is to de-essentialize and to de-homogenize this very concept of Japaneseness or Asianness in Latin American literature and culture. Despite their different literary approaches, we saw how Shinya and Matayoshi grapple with the question of what it means to be Japanese as well as what it means to be Argentine. I believe that it is this topic of immigrant identity and its complex relationship to cultural belonging that continues to permeate Nikkei literature in Argentina and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hagimoto. I usually stand up, but I think this is better, no? If we just ask if the public has some questions or some comments or any I don't know, any comments, any questions for Professor Hagimoto?
Hi, it's very interesting. I knew apparently nothing about it, so it's all very informative to me. It's very interesting. I have 4 short questions. What does the word Nikkei mean?
Nikkei means people of Japanese descent, or Japanese immigrants and people of Japan and their descendants.
I see. Okay, another question was, why did they leave Japan in the first place?
For different reasons. For people who went to Brazil and Peru, for instance, the Japanese government encouraged people to leave the country for to find better opportunities, but they also wanted to get rid of some of the populations in Japan.
Were they politically?
Yeah. I mean, Japan was a poor country at the time. Right.
Economic reasons.
Right. Economic reasons. Yeah.
Third question: why did any of them go? I see they go into the urban centers. Did some of them go to the interior, to the countryside?
What the difference? One of the differences between those who went to Brazil and others who went to Argentina was that the majority of the Japanese who went to Argentina stayed in the capital, Buenos Aires. Some went to the interior. But the opposite happened in Brazil. Many of the first Japanese immigrants went to the rural areas, working on the fields and having like sort of opening everything by themselves. So it was a very different sort of situation for them.
So there was no objection from the part of the government to situate them in one place.
Not really. Once they left the country, they didn't want to deal with these people. So yeah.
But I'm talking about the Argentinians. They didn't mind that they did not distribute them all the land.
So those who came to Argentina, they had more freedom to choose. For the first wave of Japanese immigration, most of them actually came from Brazil or Peru, escaping these harsh conditions, and came to Argentina. So like a sort of through another Latin American country as a third destination, and they settled. And the way they settled in the urban sort of city of the country was that they also had direct interaction with the locals. And they didn't. It was a small number of population too, so they weren't segregated, from the rest of the country, which also helped them assimilate in a better, sort of more easier process of assimilation. Thank you for your questions.
You may ask questions in Spanish as well if you feel more comfortable. He's a professor of Spanish, so. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, in Brazil, they were received or placed by the government to replace slaves.
Exactly.
The enormous wave of Japanese came to replace slaves that were in the cafe. That was the question. The question was that Gaijin, there is also a famous movie
Brazilian, yeah.
Gaijin is 40-year-old,
yeah.
Like that, which is a little less than the age of the author of the Argentinian novel. So I wonder if by giving it the same title, he's probably showing that he doesn't know the film and hasn't seen the film, because he wouldn't have given exactly the same title to such a famous movie and making it appear as this is the original novel. The movie was made after, which is the movie is from the 80s. Now, so the question is, does it mean that there is no contact between the communities around the country and another? How is it possible that there is such a break between community that share
Yeah.
so much in common?
No, that's a great question. And well, first of all, Gaijin is a pretty common term to refer to a foreigner. And so it's not only the title of there were a series of movies, right, in Brazil, of Gaijin 1, Gaijin 2, I think there were. And so it is also, I'm not sure if Matayoshi was aware of the Brazilian movie or not, but it was entirely possible that he just wanted to sort of, explain this foreignness of being a person of Japanese descent or Japanese immigrant in Argentina. And the second part of this question, I think you're right. There weren't many communications between the Japanese community in Brazil and the Japanese community in Argentina. Because, maybe because of the language barrier, maybe because of the physical distance, but also because in Brazil, within Brazil, the Japanese community was not didn't have this unifying sense of identity. There were internal conflicts within the Japanese community depending on what part of Japan you're from. You have this specific sort of origin, right, which might be reflected on the way you speak the language. And there in Brazil, because the community was so large, there were, of course, conflicts. Even during the war, there were people who believed that Japan had actually won the war. They had this blind faith in the empire, and they refused to accept, that Japan has lost the war. And in fact, there was this terrorist group known as Shindo Renmei, who sort of advocated violence against people who believed otherwise, that Japan, sort of like a fake news, to use today's term, right? So it was difficult even within the country to have this unifying force as a Japanese person, quote unquote.
There's this beautiful book and movie, Corazones Sucios. Bueno, mi portugués es terrible, ¿no? Pero Corazones Sucios, el libro, y una película también, es interesantísima sobre esta secta, podríamos llamarle, ¿no? Secta, ¿no? Que nos cuenta esa historia. Perdón que interrumpí, pero yo solamente quería decir que esta novela, Gaijin, la novela, es una novela maravillosa, es una novela, yo creo que dentro de la producción Nikkei es una gran obra, si no, quizás la mejor, yo creo, en narrativa, en novela. Es una novela preciosa, realmente la disfruté muchísimo, ¿no? Así que qué bueno que estés, pues, trabajando críticamente sobre ella, que es tan importante, ¿no? Y bueno, yo quería también decir un poco sobre, parece que los Nikkei ahora ya tienen mucho más contacto, ¿no? Los Nikkei
ahora sí,
¿no?
Con la globalización y todo,
sí,
es mucho más fácil, ¿no? Tener ese contacto directo.
Sí, ¿no? Porque se comunican entre
Sí, porque la red es siempre transnacional, ¿no? La diáspora se habla en diferentes idiomas y incluso pueden viajar. Y hay un convento de Nikkei como estudiantes o en Panamá creo que hubo una vez y creo que cada año o cada 2 años, si no, siempre se reúnen, ¿no?
Convenciones,
claro,
sí. Ya. ¿Y qué otras, el proyecto para parece muy interesante. Hay algo más que, por supuesto, que estudiaste mucho más para este libro, ¿no? Que tienes en camino. ¿Hay algo más que te haya parecido insólito o súper interesante, algo que hayas aprendido a través de este proyecto?
Pues nada, a mí me interesó este proyecto porque ya había estudiado, ¿no?, la historia de los japoneses en Brasil y Perú, y cuando uno habla de los japoneses en Latinoamérica, ahí va, ¿no? Son dos países con grandes comunidades japonesas. Pero Argentina es el tercer país y no hay, bueno, por lo menos antes no hubo ningún tipo de estudio así de literatura, de cultura. Siempre hay, digamos, piezas históricas, ¿no? Pero quería aprender más sobre la producción literaria, cultural, y me pareció extraño, ¿no?, esta idea del prejuicio positivo que existía en Argentina hacia los japoneses, lo cual se puede también contrastar con la percepción muy negativa de otros asiáticos, como los chinos, los coreanos, que sí fueron, digamos, víctimas de discriminación en los años 60 y ahora también contra los chinos en Argentina. Es decir, me interesó la posición, digamos, la recepción, ¿no?, especial que tenían los japoneses, y quería entender el por qué. Sí.
Bueno, parece que va a ser un proyecto es un proyecto muy interesante.
Muchas gracias.
Sí, en una clase de cine vimos el otro día una película sobre un cuento chino.
Un cuento chino, sí.
Chino, ¿no?
Gracias,
y sobre, ¿no?
Ajá, sí,
sobre los chinos en Argentina.
Ajá.
Y muy interesante la película, ¿no?
Y hay también, ¿verdad?, existe ese problema de no presentar subtítulos, ¿verdad? Nunca sabemos qué es lo que está diciendo el protagonista chino, ¿verdad?
Sí, es cierto, sí es
O sea,
cierto.
es cómico porque no entendemos, pero el problema es que ese protagonista chino no tiene la agencia, no puede hablar, ¿verdad? Por sí.
Ajá, sí, y cuando está hablando,
No hay subtítulos.
No hay subtítulos.
Claro.
Muy interesante, ¿no? O sea, sí, eso.
Y se habla de su acento en español y creo que o sea, es una comedia,
Claro.
pero también, ¿verdad?, se puede, digamos, criticar, ¿no?, ese aspecto, ¿no?,
Sí.
de la estereotipación.
Sí, claro. Bien, no sé si el público tengo una pregunta para el profesor. Sí.
So what do you think Japanese people, or in general, people refer to them as Chinese, like the Chinos? Is it because people are ignorant, or is it because of the prejudice and discrimination?
It is more cultural than political, in the sense, the political as in, like in America, right? It is a political statement, or and it is becoming, people are becoming more aware of this issue, and so people use a different term or be more specific or more nuanced, right? The language is becoming more nuanced. But in the sort of the public mind or the cultural sort of mindset of not just Argentina, but in Latin America, anybody who looks Asian is Chino. And even those who are of Asian descent accept that it is what it is, and they sort of make fun of themselves sometimes, and they become, that becomes part of who they are. So the kind of language related to race works in a very different way in Latin America. And even with the kind of political persecutions or campaigns against the Japanese in Brazil, for instance,
there was a term, Ponha, which is the reversal of Hapon, right?
Yeah.
Ponha was sometimes used to make fun of people of Japanese descent. And so it's not the only example of language being used against people of Japanese descent. But I think in general there is still this notion that it is okay or it is acceptable to refer to people of Asian descent as Chinos. Unfortunately, and it is sometimes not intentional, but the fact that still the language still exists, I think, is a problem.
Monica, personal question: which book do you like the most, like of the two that you presented?
I liked the second one. I mean, it is more contemporary, but also there are certain things that I can relate to. As an immigrant myself, living in a different country, of course, but there are certain themes, right? Like the question of home, like what it means to belong to a place. What it means to speak multiple languages, and sort of be lost in that sort of, bilingual or trilingual space, right? Or even embracing everything and say everything is my home, And I think, and for those reasons, I liked the Gaijin better.
Yes.
Una pregunta más.
Ujú.
La primera generación, que yo sepa, desde los sainetes criollos en adelante, sustituye la R por la L
Ujú.
cuando hablan. No están semisilencio, sino que hablan, pero de esa manera.
Ujú.
La segunda generación ya no lo hace.
¿Qué opinas?
Yo creo que ya no lo hace.
Sí.
Yo creo que ya no
Es
lo
lo que
hace,
diría.
no. Pero más bien es porque en japonés, a ver, un momentito, en japonés sí existe la rarebiru, ¿no? Rarebiru. Mientras que, entonces, el japonés no diría la en lugar de la, ¿no? Creo que son más bien los chinos los que en lugar
Sí.
de la R utilizan la L, ¿no?
Ustedes pensaban en maravillosa, por ejemplo, la de Saltanione,
Ujú.
no, le habla de esa manera. Pero esa es primera generación, pienso. La
Ya.
segunda
Ujú.
no. Ajá.
Ya, sí. No, y van evolucionando, ¿no? Por eso el
Ujú.
libro de él, ¿no? Cómo es que escriben en un español, ¿no? Perfecto, ¿no? O incluso porteño, o qué sé yo, ¿no?
Claro, sí.
¿No? O sea, bien, sí, acá.
I was a little bit confused. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that the Japanese, they were taken from Argentina in World War II to be in concentration camps in America?
From Peru.
From Peru.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So this is a history that's still largely unknown, right, to the public. In America or even within the Japanese community in Peru, they don't want to talk about it. These people, once again, were seen as enemies, right, within the country because Japan was, the enemy of the United States, and the U.S. pressured Peru to send, Japanese nationals and even Peruvians of Japanese descent. And send them to the U.S. internment camps so they could use these people in exchange for the American soldiers captured by the Japanese army. And so it was a negotiation between the Peruvian government and the American government. What's very unfortunate about that is that so there were more than 1,700 people who were kidnapped and sent to U.S. internment camps in Texas, New Mexico, and in America we talk about the internment camps of Japanese Americans, and that's an important part of Asian American history. But the fact that there were Peruvians and there were, Mexicans, Brazilians, of Japanese descent, that's like, still not taught, right, as part of the American history. And also after the war, these people were not permitted to return to Peru because the government didn't let them. And so they didn't know where to go. They couldn't go back to Japan. They couldn't, stay in America. And they weren't allowed to go back to Peru. And they ended up going to different places. But the fact that the Peruvian government didn't let them, return to their homeland was kind of a very difficult situation for these people.
There is a book, about this.
Yeah, there's testimonial. Seiji Higashi desu, Adios to Tears.
Adios to Tears is called this book about this Japanese who was brought to this interview.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming during this very rainy day, or I think it started to rain at 5 o'clock.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, and if you want to approach Professor Hagimoto, by all means, okay?
Thank you.
You were trying to ask questions there, so please, by all means.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。わかりました。全然大丈夫です。わかりました。
私がちょっと気になりましたのは、アルゼンチンにいらっしゃる人その方のアイデンティティっていうのは、私は日本で生まれて、日本で育って25歳でアメリカに来たんですけど、それ以来アメリカに来たんですけど、やっぱり自分はアメリカに住んでる日本人はアメリカに